Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's session, which will focus on the sustainability and viability of the NGO sector in a post-COVID-19 South Africa. It is my pleasure to introduce Lorenzo, CEO of Community Chest.
Good evening and welcome. Thank you to everyone online. It's good to be with you tonight. And I want to make this as conversational as possible. I want to deep dive in dialogues with you around where we are over the next 90 minutes and listen, engage conversationally with you. So I hope you'll enjoy the dialogue, the discussion. My name is Lorenzo, I'm from Community Chest. We serve in a sector and in a country and in a globe that we are passionate about. And so I hope this conversation is going to be enriching. There are lots of people online, and we want to inspire you to think, probe, challenge, engage, because that's really what this is about. This is about no canned answers. We do not have answers. We want to have a conversation where we together explore how we build a strong and robust social sector or third sector in this country. What are those questions we need to ask is probably where we need to begin. So what are the new questions that NGOs must be asking as they emerge out of the sort of COVID-19 era, or as they live in this COVID-19 era? One of the key points I want to make right at the outset on this particular issue is that I want to guard against this notion that there is this new normal, because there isn't. There is no new normal. Let me be clear about that, because that's my point of departure. So frame the new questions we need to ask in the sector. Secondly, there is no new normal, because for the majority of citizens in our country, at least, and from big parts of the world, there is what I call a far worse off old normal. What they had as their normal in stages of varying degrees of disadvantage is now a far worse off normal. And that's the reality that communities are facing. That's where the challenges are within the space. So what are these concepts that we have to deal with? These concepts include words such as ambiguity, not knowing what is next, words such as paradox. How is it possible that that's true? Because it cannot be true. Thirdly, contradictions, ambiguity, paradox, contradictions. Things don't make sense anymore. Complexity, the things that cannot simply be worked out. Thirdly, the issue of volatility. We live in an extremely volatile space. And lastly, uncertain, the issue of what are the risks within the sector. So we can explore ambiguity, paradox, contradictions, complexities, volatility, and uncertainty as we try and reconstruct for ourselves where we are. And a lot of that is going to have some deconstruction that needs to take place. So there are three questions I want to pose within this particular space. The first question is, we need to all ask ourselves, what do we know? That's one of my new questions. What do we know? The second question I'm asking myself is, why do those things that we know now matter? Why are those things now the new important things? And the third question I ask myself is, what are we trying to solve now? So much has changed around us, and do we understand now what we are trying to solve? And so those are the dialogues I want to get into. Now this is about who we are. This is about our journey as a country. This is about our journey in the world in which we live. There was a wonderful article in the Sunday Times of about 2 years ago on the work of a transgender sex worker. And as I read the article, there was a fascinating quote the individual made in the piece. and the question that the person posed is, as they were engaged in the practice, and as they were an individual living in this context and in our country, they asked the question, for who will I perform my poverty today? And I suppose it's the question that most people ask now. How does our poverty now inspire how low, how high, how intense we will have to perform to convince people to invest money in what we do. We have some amazing people online. We have Abdul Rekler from the Western Cape government here. I'm going to ask him to engage with us later on. We have Rihanna Rousseau here, who's a consultant in this space here as well. We have Professor Eric Atmore on the call as well. And so I'd love to engage with them and hear their views as well. So this journey is a journey that I'm excited about to engage with you in the space tonight. So I hope that you will pose your questions as richly as you wish to and talk to me about those things. So get right into it and pose a question and make sure that, that we can engage with you as much as possible. We live in a changed world. Somewhere around 25% of NGOs right now are in serious closure discussions. They are putting out calls for additional funding, rescue money. They are retrenching staff. They cannot access their donors. They can no longer manage the operational cost of the organization. The overheads are not funded. And it's a massive crisis. It is said somewhere that over 200,000 people will no longer be able to afford electricity within the next 18 months due to poverty. The cascading impact of that number will ripple through the economy like a tidal wave, because if people don't have access to power, it diminishes their ability to compete in any kind of economy. NGOs are particularly vulnerable because they're at the end of that food chain. Being grant recipients. And so we have the space that is now extremely vulnerable because of those 8 words that I mentioned. It's become a challenging occupation to run an NGO that provides services to people. So in asking those questions and in looking at the space, we have to engage and say to ourselves, what critical thinking is required now and what problem solving is required now? And when we say critical thinking, we ask you to probe deeply about what the new reality is. What is the space that we have to be engaged with now? So engaging with the world in a critical way by asking questions that challenges the dominant narrative. What's the dominant narrative? The dominant narrative says that if you have access to money, or if you have a big NGO, or if you are well known, you can somehow get through this. But if you look at the data, that's about the top 4% of NGOs in this country. The other 96% of the NGOs, most of them have less than 2 million rands worth of operating cost per year. It's a huge challenge to that 96% of the 98% of the NGO market. And so it's a real crisis. So how do we challenge the dominant narrative? How do we also begin to look at the space through new lenses? So where there are questions, I'd like you to engage with you. I'm going to ask you to come on live with me on air and pose your question live on video. My team will pick up your question. And if there are questions, then I would love to engage with you on that. The other thing that I think is important is not only is critical thinking and problem solving critical in the space right now, but I think the other thing that emerges for me in the space is there certainly is a need for us. There certainly is a need for us to collaborate far more strategically. Silo NGOs are not going to survive. If we don't collaborate with each other, form partnerships, form mergers, form networks, and work with each other, share funding resources, we are not going to survive. Let me talk quickly about mergers in NGOs. It is now time that mergers become a discussion on the table, where NGOs who share similar objectives are like-minded, not necessarily in the same community or area, but share a similar outcome, that they deeply consider a merger with each other. So much of the NGO sector is based on the personality cult of leaders. And all of us face that risk that we become bigger than the work that we do. And that it stands in the way of sense-making collaboration between NGO leaders, NGO boards, NGO management teams. And one of the things we're going to have to deal with in this space is to look at collaboration across networks, collaboration across sectors in the NGO space, collaboration across funding opportunities. That in itself is the next big thing. So besides now employing critical thinking and problem solving is the issue of how do NGOs collaborate with each other, from forming partnerships to creating mergers, to creating spaces for networking that are not just talk shops. And let me bring networking and partnerships and mergers beyond the issue of having nice tea and cake and coffee and discussing our problems mutually or sharing our concerns mutually about the sector. No, this is about actively partnering with each other to collaborate around a community issue, or to collaborate around doing things together, or sharing funding information, sharing funding resources. Those are the things that we're going to begin to have to do in a very hard way, and give up some of the sort of traditional leadership roles we've played to make sure that we don't lose more people in the sector, but in fact can save jobs and can save the future of NGOs where there are sensible mergers and partnerships formed. So one of the things we have to do is to actively share who's funding us and give other people access to those funders. That's one of the big no-nos in the sector at the moment that irritates the heck out of me. I want to make sure that people can begin to talk to each other about collaborating and working with each other. So yeah, I'm very keen to engage with you and see how we can build that. I'm going to make a fourth point or third point in this space, which I think I just want to leave with you before I take any questions. And I know there may be questions, so I'm going to pause and just wait for my team to see if there are questions. The third point I want to make in this space is our ability to create spaces to access and analyze information. Data is the new currency. We know that for the last 2 years already with the launch of artificial intelligence, etc. That data is a currency right now. Having information is a currency, and making sure that you have access to information is absolutely critical. People must not hide information from you. So we have to understand what are the dominant constructs in getting access to information. What are the messages in the new information? How do you get the information that you need as an NGO, or as an NGO community, or as an NGO leader, or as an NGO management team? How do you get access to the latest information? People are using information to promote themselves or to make others feel less important in the sector. And that's a thing that bothers me. We are not going to survive if we don't create spaces where people on an equitable basis can begin to access information. So how do we influence these knowledge paradigms that exist, the spaces where knowledge sits, is created, and is controlled, so that those little towers of power is deconstructed and everybody has access to the data. People can't write funding proposals because right now they can't get access to the latest data. People can't talk to donors intelligently because now they can't access the latest data. So in closing, those are the things I want to talk about tonight. I want you to have an open dialogue with me and have some discussion about where we need to take this sector. So it's about critical thinking and problem solving. It's about accessing information and access to data, and it's about collaborating and forming networks and mergers that make sense in this new world. Without those three things, I believe we are not going to survive and get beyond this. This is not a pity party. I hope you're going to have fun with me, and I hope that we can engage intelligently in this space. I'm going to take a question now.
Lorenzo, our first
Mary, is
question,
that you? Are you on?
Yes, that's Mary Gillett de Klerk. Mary, you can pose your question to Lorenzo. Please unmute yourself.
Hello, I'm Mary Gillett de Klerk. I'm from an organization called JOSH, dealing with the homeless in Joburg. I'm also, I'm a firm believer in networking and in actually mergers and acquisitions. But my question is to generally any ideas with government being so cash strapped and already in some regards, and not reneging, but falling short in its provision of services and also of funding to NGOs, no matter how vital they are. We need a whole load of ideas to become self-sufficient. And I'm looking for any ideas from.
So the question is that we have a cash-strapped government. We have donors who have a delay and divert approach currently to funding. They delay the funding decisions, and they've diverted the funding to COVID-19 efforts. And so NGOs are fairly cash-strapped. What are the new ideas to raise money? So that question, if I knew the answer to that, I would certainly be making a lot of money right now. But I think it's a very important question to ask, because there are now new ways to make money. And I'm going to say this to you, Mary, and I'm going to ask the group to respond to you as well. So put your advice to Mary in the chat. But here is the fundamental thing that I think is important. There is a new intelligence required. There's a new conversation in the NGO space. So much of what we do is now going to end up as important, but not the leading issue anymore. How do we now connect with donors to say, yes, we're doing ECD, or yes, we're doing community safety, or yes, we are doing feeding of homeless people, or we are talking to vulnerable youth. But how we now enter that space, what do we frame as the position right now, is the new knowledge. And that's where we want to help NGOs in particular, because yes, your project is still relevant, but what do you lead with to enter the dialogue with donors today? And there's a whole set of conversations around that. What gives you entry into the room with donors today? And understanding that will allow us to get into a conversation with donors around the new practice. So one of the things that donors want to know, for example, is the issue of your understanding of the world we live in. Too many NGOs have a poor understanding of the context in which they live in. They don't have data. They don't read. They don't engage intelligently in the space. They trade on offering the donor a sort of sympathy case to make money. We know that from the past, it doesn't work. None of that is going to give us access to any funding. I've always believed for decades now that when you go see a funder, you bring your intelligence into the space. I have for the last 10 years never taken a presentation to a donor. Never. I've not engaged in taking my PowerPoints or my pamphlets or my material or resources into the room. When I'm with a donor, I discuss the issues that will make the world a better place. I try and convince the donor in a dialogue, in a conversation about the need for the kinds of stuff we are engaged with. The presentation, the pamphlets, the material, the photographs, whatever it is we traditionally send into that space always comes 3, 4, 5, 6 days, a week later. Because money is about building a relationship. It's about getting into the headspace of the donor so that they do not ever forget you. I have had a practice over the years now, and my colleagues will know this. They laugh at me in this organization of ours. I've had a practice over the last 15 years that I see no donor for longer than 10 minutes. If I go to visit a donor for a very specific reason, or I do a cold call on a donor that has been set up for me, or I've set it up, I see no donor for longer than 10 minutes. And after 10 minutes, by minute 9, I end the meeting, Mary. I stop it. I do not get involved in further discussion. And I say, sir, madam, it was great to meet with you, or John or Carol, it was great to meet with you. My time is up. I'd love to see you again sometime, but I appreciate you giving me 10 minutes of your time. Here's what I want to say to you. People frown at me and say, my goodness, that's crazy. Let me say this to you. I've never been denied a second or third meeting of 10 minutes. And I have somewhere in the region of about a 93% success rate with the donors I've seen on that basis. You must know that your core business is not necessarily the donor's core business. Let me say that again. Your core business is not necessarily the donor's core business. And if you take the donor through an hour-long presentation, think of your own meetings. You have lost that donor by slide number 5. They're no longer looking at the screen and they're no longer hearing your voice. What we have to do is in the new world, in COVID-19, we got to make connections. We got to connect with people. We got to have conversations with them. We got to talk intelligently with them. We got to engage in soundbite pieces that does not overburden the already stressed ecosystem we are in. We raise more money in processes where we are not trying to sell ourselves, but where we talk about creating a better world and not just us. We don't raise money for us. We raise money to create a better world. And I couldn't care, whether in the conversation with the donor, our name comes up. What I am concerned is that this donor is beginning to enter into a relationship with me. We started a conversation with the donor in 2014, 2013, just when I started that community chest. And it wasn't until 2015 of having these 10-minute conversations with the donor that the donor gave us the management of a grant system that was worth around 8 million rand. That's what I'm talking about. Share with the donor your intelligence about the world you live in. Don't just try and raise money. Let me get to the next question.
We just have a comment from Patsy Daniels on the merger of NGOs sounds viable, especially in local communities. Thank you for that, Patsy. Our next question is from Alan Wolfson. Alan, are you with us? Okay, let's move to, there we go. Welcome, Alan.
Hi. I think the question for Lorenzo, and I mean, I know Lorenzo extremely well. And yeah, he's an incredible person. But my question is, should there not be a lot more takeovers by larger NGOs of the small NGOs? Because the small NGOs only have a very limited amount of money, obviously, that they can spend. They can't make a huge impact, whereas the bigger NGOs need more and more money to make a bigger and bigger impact. I'm just looking at it from a consolidation point of view, if Lorenzo believes that this is a thing that could or should happen.
Alan, thank you for that question. That sort of ties in with my thinking around mergers. Now, I want to be careful to use the word takeovers. I want to say that larger NGOs should show more concern for smaller NGOs that serve in the same sector as theirs, and not necessarily put them out of business, but strengthen them as the front end of service delivery and support the resource development of that local NGO. So yes, maybe it is a consolidation. I use the word merger, but if we were to consolidate early childhood development instead of huge fragmented operational entities that are all struggling to survive, and we can consolidate some of the efforts, we can consolidate the feeding pipeline for ECDs, we can consolidate the payment of staff salaries for ECDs, which is now a huge crisis in COVID-19. If we can consolidate the facilities development of NGOs, of ECD facilities, those are all issues where we can present to the donor a strategic package of services. So for example, I know of donors, and some of you may know too, Rihanna them and Eric them will know. And Rihanna and Eric, if you want to come on, and Abdul, if you want to come on and just go on live and just make a comment or a statement, I'd welcome you to do so. So the issue is that where those things exist, where donors are looking at the sector at the moment, they are asking the question, why are these people not working together? Because a donor can far readily appreciate a 1 million rand application from 3 NGOs or 5 NGOs than what they have to sit with a 10,000 rand request from one NGO, and there isn't enough information there to know that there's a solid NGO behind that application. Bigger NGOs, and this is my call to bigger NGOs, reach out to the smaller NGOs. Don't put them out of business, strengthen them by bringing them under your wing, mentor them, invest in them, so that they too can grow. It's what we at Community Chest has done over the years, and now in far more strategic ways, where we've adopted some NGOs as strategic partners. They are smaller than us in some ways, but they are essential in the work that they do, and strengthening their outreach, not putting them out of business, strengthening their outreach is what we should be concerned about.
The next question is from Ridwan Ali. Ridwan.
Hi there. I think Lorenzo responded to that question that I had. I think he was probably reading my mind at the time. But I think the question around mergers and tighter partnerships for the bigger organizations, with particularly in early childhood development, I think it's critical that we start looking at building the capacity that Lorenzo is talking about. But I think what now that I have the opportunity, maybe just to ask, given the challenges that bigger organizations also have with regards to future sustainability, is this the time to start looking at building that endowment, or is it slightly too late?
Thank you, Ridwan. I appreciate your question, and thank you for the work that you guys do as well. I appreciate that. Whether we build an endowment in the sector in this time period is always a challenge. In fact, building an endowment in any period is a challenge, for NGOs especially. We did an analysis of the grantees we fund in, I think it was 2015 or 2016, and of the some I think 300 NGOs at the time that we were funding. When we added up the collective endowment value, it was somewhere around 200 million that these NGOs were sitting on in an endowment, so as an investment for a rainy day. And I was quite shocked by that number, to know that if you added up all the monies that these NGOs, these 300 NGOs were holding, there was something like 200 million, 220 million, if I recall the figure correctly, at the time. This was way back in 2015. And so I was thinking about that. Why are we not wiser about how we manage those reserves that we hold, and seek to grow them collectively, and seek to grow them as a sector that builds a strong and robust investment case for donors? Again, now is the time, but yesterday was also the time to build it. And pre-COVID-19 was also the time to build it. Any time is the right time to build an endowment, because it is about future sustainability. Waiting for some kind of crisis to now go to donors and pitch an endowment to them is not necessarily wise. We should always be working on building a reserve for ourselves to operate from. Now, that is not easy. Let me be the first to say that is never easy. We have a large cohort of donors that's fairly uneducated about that, and don't easily give money that you can keep and hold in the reserve and not use and live off its capital growth. Very few donors in this country at least have that mindset. Convincing corporate South Africa to give you money that you can put away for a rainy day is a tough sell. But I hope the donor community matures enough to know, and what I had explored as an idea a few years ago, which we haven't done, but I certainly am keen to implement it. Of every grant we give an NGO, my idea was that as a donor ourselves, we should be saying to the NGO, we're going to give you, this is the amount of money, this is 100% of what we're going to give you. 75% of what we give you is a grant for operations, and 25% is money we will put aside for you as an endowment. And we grow that for you every year. So whatever grant we give you, we'll give you 75% in cash as a transfer to your bank account, and 25% we'll put aside for you in a separate account as an endowment. And when you have a crisis, you can come to us and we'll say to you, we'll take money from our endowment, which we are holding for you, or take money from your endowment, which we are holding for you. And every donor should embrace that practice, because that's what breeds security for the rainy day, which we are now all experiencing. So grant making should be a lot wiser. NGOs are struggling to get that message across. I think donors should believe that message more than NGOs, that we should not only give money for now, but also make money available for later. So, because there's going to come a day when that NGO is going to knock on your door and say, hey, I'm in a real crisis, can you help me out? And then you say, no, we don't have any money. But if you donate it in a wise way, and my rule was to grant 75% and put 25% of what we could grant away into an endowment account that will grow for that NGO. That's the process, I think, that will build wise processes and avoid the immediate crisis cash, the immediate cash crisis that we all face. Thank you.
Thank you, Lorenzo. Our next participant is Andrew Lamur. Welcome, Andrew.
Sorry, man, I'm not sitting in the right place. I am particularly interested in, thank you, Lorenzo, for your introduction. It's quite informative. I'm particularly interested, working from my space, in the issue of the decolonization of wealth within the context of the South African philanthropic space. I think somehow or other we sort of overlook the fact that in a particular field, we almost forget to think that those who have wealth are not really connected to the people on the ground in terms of race. I could be well off the mark here in terms of sustainability and viability, but I think those who are close or who are close to those who have access to money are more viable and more sustainable. And I think there's an issue that needs to be addressed in terms of, maybe I'm not using the right word, but the decolonization of wealth is an issue for me. Because the closer you are to people of wealth, the more likely you are able to survive.
Thank you for that, Andrew.
Let me address that issue as best I know. And again, I'm inviting others to comment on this issue as well. So if you want a speaking turn, please, just post it in the group and say I want a speaking turn. Decolonization is a practice we should be embracing and have been embracing in this country. There are sectors of the market, and especially in the financial services sector, where that is not as robust a practice as we know it now. But as the students taught us in the Fees Must Fall movement, is that the decolonization starts with the decolonization of knowledge and the decolonization of the mind. And all of us should go into a dialogue about how do we decolonize our minds, how do we decolonize knowledge. So I said to you the second point, or the third point that I made here this evening in my introduction is the accessing and analyzing of information. It's critical that we begin to look at what are the dominant constructs. So who holds the power? Who holds the money? Who is engaged in the education? How do we influence knowledge and views? How do we democratize knowledge and access? It's critically important that in this space, we begin to construct new thought patterns, new thought ideas around how we talk about money. Now, let's face it that a significant portion of the wealth is in the hands of fairly affluent people. And that affluent group is still fairly Caucasian in this country, and globally it's the same. What we have to go and do as a community, as a third sector, is train ourselves to begin to talk about those processes. So for example, I wrote a comment on a matter, on the current debate around race in this country. And I have a view because, should we be non-racial, anti-racist, race active, race aware, race passive? And I said that in my understanding of the current dialogues of what happens in race, for example, is that we cannot afford to be a race passive society. A. B, we must become a race aware society. And thirdly, we have to become an anti-racist society. Not non-racist, anti-racist society, because racism lives. So if you're non-racist, you simply ignore it. But if you're anti-racist, you talk about it. You drive policies that addresses anti-racism. So there are some policies that ignores race entirely, but there are some policies that addresses race by being anti-racism. It's the same when we talk about gender-based violence. We are anti the violence that women suffer. So the policy addresses that issue that if you commit violence, there's a policy that will speak to that. Those are the fundamental constructs that we have to talk about. It is no longer sufficient in the body of knowledge that exists for NGOs, especially in the donor construct, to simply talk about your project, the kids in Tafelsig, the poverty in Lavender Hill, the food crisis in Mfuleni, the challenges in the healthcare system, the breakdown in education. It's simply no longer sufficient. Leaders of NGOs and fundraisers must equip themselves with these dialogues I'm referring to. You have to talk about these things, and you have to develop a view on it. You have to position yourself so that when you're in that context, you can have sense-making conversations and not avoid these issues or be passive about them and not have a view, or avoid advancing a critical consciousness. Because unless you develop that critical consciousness, you simply are placating the dominant narrative. And that's where the problem exists for us in society, is that too many NGOs serve the dominant narrative. I was saying to a group of people today that I don't understand how in the time of COVID-19 and its injustices perpetrated against people by law enforcement, by police, by the SANDF, by the corruption that is going on, that there are NGOs who will not take a stand on social justice, on justice. They will simply say, no, we didn't get involved in that. That's not our issue. You have to take a stand, because that's how you demonstrate your decolonization, that you are not serving the dominant construct, the dominant narrative. So it's very important that you begin to have views on these matters. This morning in an interview, I said that we have to have, the worst thing that can happen to this country is that we become race passive. I said that we must become race aware, because the more that I'm aware of it, the more I protect yourself. Let me give you an example. People who fear that their houses will be burgled, they are very aware of what's going on. They fortify themselves. They put security all around their place. They sign up for alarm companies and systems and neighborhood watches because they are security aware. In the same way, we have to be race aware and take out the necessary steps that's required to build an equitable, just, prosperous, and safe South Africa. And so if we don't do these things, we simply will forever stay with the dominant narrative and never challenge it, never raise an issue with it. And what will happen downstream? What's the downstream effect of this? The downstream effect of this is that you will always queue for money and not know whether you'll be accepted. When I engage with people, I know what they are thinking politically. I know what they think about justice. I know where they stand socially. So we can no longer afford a kind of narrative that avoids all these conflict issues and not build not have a commitment and orientation towards a justice that builds a safe, inclusive, robust, democratic, prosperous South Africa. That's what we are building. I want everybody to live in a safe country. I want our streets to be safe. I want people to celebrate the fact that they can walk in their neighborhoods or take public transport. I love public transport because I'm a public transport user. That people can take public transport and immerse themselves in the life of this country instead of living behind their fearful gates and existences. But it starts with me decolonizing my mind. And that conversation NGOs must have with themselves. What do they stand for? What do they believe? Because it will fundamentally influence the kind of money you will get downstream. I want to close with this part. I know there are more questions. I'm going to close with this part. You either get investment money from a donor or you get go away money from a donor. Let me say that again. You either get investment money from a donor or you get go away money from a donor. There are donors who truly believe in what you do and love what you stand for and appreciate the values you hold and commit to the ideas that you share. And those are what I call investment money. But when NGOs are simply satisfied to get a quick check from a donor, I call that go away money. The donor simply wants to get rid of you. They're not engaging you. Now you say to me, oh, I'm happy to get go away money. Well, you're not going to get it again. And that's why there's a funding crisis in most NGOs. They don't build a pipeline of intelligent engagement. They simply want to check. And the check normally means get away from me. I don't want to talk to you anymore. I want to change that narrative. I want donors and NGOs to engage in deep, robust, intelligent spaces and dialogues, because that downstream is where the sustainability lies.
Thank you, Lorenzo. Next up, we have Lizelle de Wet from the Cape Town Society for the Blind. She has a quick statement that she wants you to respond. Welcome, Lizelle.
Colleen, sure. I did not expect you to invite me to say something. Lorenzo, I think what you are saying here is absolutely profound. And I think we really needed this kind of information and this kind of dialogue for a long time. And I've listened to one of the speakers who asked a question about endowment, and I think you really responded brilliantly by saying it's a little bit late for that. Why must a COVID-19 always sort of shock us to the roots before we actually take action? I think that NGOs must really pull take ourselves by the bootstrings and say, come on, we need to think business-like. We need to think like running our own businesses. We need to think like a corporate thinks. We cannot just go stand hat in hand and always ask donors to bail us out. That has long gone. And I think we had many discussions in the past about this, that we need to take responsibility for our own funding as well and build that very important networks and relationships. I love the way that you ended off your previous comment by saying investment money from a donor versus go away money. I think it's absolutely fantastic. And I must commend my board by taking me by the hand when I joined them 9 years ago and said, come on, let's just do that. And we embraced that. And the fruits that it bore for the organization is amazing. And I also love so much what you said about asking a donor, give me 75% for a project, but allow me to use 25% to put into an endowment fund. It worked for us. And I'm humble when I say it, when I say that we are one of the very fortunate organizations who are in the top 4% of being able to sustain ourselves should there be a next crisis in terms of losing the little bit of funding that we are receiving from government, because we cannot rely on those funding. So thank you so much. I think you are spot on with your conversation here. Sorry
thank you, Lizelle.
My videos. Sorry, Colleen.
No problem.
Okay.
Thank you, Lizelle.
Thank you.
Next, we have Stacey Jones. Welcome, Stacey.
Thanks very much. Hi, Lorenzo, Colleen.
Hello.
Thank you so much.
Hello, Stacey.
Hi. Lorenzo, I'm just essentially going back to, you're talking about the consolidation of efforts by NGOs and presenting to the donors a strategic package of services. And we have essentially found ourselves over the past 5 months within COVID pulled together. As you know, we are in the substance use disorder sector, and which is, one of the sectors that is quite difficult to absorb, I think, by donors. We talk about a safe community, and often these are people that make our environments unsafe, etc. But those of us that work within the sector understand that substance use disorders often come from a place of deep trauma, deep intergenerational trauma in this country. And we were inadvertently pulled together a few organizations pull together just naturally to assist in this time of the pandemic because of the, you know, severe withdrawals, etc., trying to save lives. So that was quite an interesting thing that came quite naturally. Now, my question to you is, how do we, you know, I loved what you said about sitting with the donors, coming in, you understand, you have that knowledge, you have that data, but how do we actually grip the donor to even want to come and talk to us, you know, to get that first sit in with the information, because I agree with you on all aspects of what you've said, and I agree with you that we have to consolidate, we have to pull together, and it's worked, pooling resources, etc. So yeah, that's just my long and short of my question.
Great question, Stacey. Thank you. Let me reply very quickly. We serve at Community Chairs. I serve as a donor, as a grant maker. We fund NGOs. I go to loads of meetings, or I'm asked for loads of meetings with entities. Frequently, the entire week, I have people request meetings from me. I can tell you nothing pleases me more than if an NGO spends no more than 10 minutes with me. Nothing pleases a donor more when I do not spend more than 10 minutes with him. I can give you that as a guarantee. You can bank that. I often leave a donor meeting or a meeting with an NGO and I go like, you know, we could have wrapped this up in 10 minutes because I really want to fund them. They did not have to go through an hour-long presentation. I know this issue. Here's one of the things that I want to say on this issue is that most people in this country try and convince a donor of their cause. When I say to you, what I would do is convince the donor of your intelligence. Convince the donor of your intelligence. Tell them about how you know what you're talking about. So the first question I said to you, I have 3 questions I always run through my mind is, what do you know? Why does it matter? And what are you solving? It's always about what do you know? And I know in the first 2, 3 minutes, 5 minutes of any meeting, whether the person knows what they're talking about or do not know. And so you ask me, how do you get access to the donor? Call the donor up and say, I want no more than 10 minutes of your time. Get in there. You will get a 10-minute meeting. You will not get an hour-long meeting. I have had many 10-minute meetings with donors who have given me 10 minutes over and over and over. But if I should ask for an hour, they would decline me. And when as I said to you earlier on, when it's 9 minutes, I get up and say I'm done. And I do not continue with the conversation. But I know if I call him again and say, hey, I'd like to pick up where we left off, or sometimes I get asked, can you come back? And we'd like to chat to you about what you said. There's something we want you to do. Those are the basic fundamentals that's missing in most of the fundraising education people get. Because you are taught to write proposals and get documentation and, you know, present to the donor. It's the front part of that whole exercise that's missing in the dialogue. And the front part is, how do you get the donor to listen to you? A, sell your intelligence. Secondly, don't use more time than 10 minutes. Trust me on that one. I am 58 years old. I've been in the NGOs since about the age of 28. I am convinced of what I'm telling you here today. You want to, have a long conversation? That will come once you have the relationship. You do not have a long conversation if you don't have the relationship. It's the magic that's missing from fundraising training. Spend as little time in the beginning so that you can get access to longer time at the end. Now, most of us fear that we're going to not have enough time. Get that fear out of your mind, because you may be meeting great donors, but you switch them off because you're talking too long, as my colleagues are telling me I'm doing right now.
Thank you, Lorenzo. Next, we have Pat Meyers. Welcome, Pat.
Hi, Lorenzo.
Hello,
Thank
Pat.
you. Hi. I have an interesting question. You know, I work as the chairperson of an NGO locally, but we're linked to a national NGO. And so my question is, and there's debate within the branches, for want of a better word, who are all actually independent, about nationalizing, for want of a better word. Where there's central control of the finance, central control of the HR policies, just about everything else. And then the local NGO effectively acts as a branch with limited capacity for independent thinking. That has impact for how does the board function in such a situation? Are there advantages and disadvantages? One of the challenges of this organization is who speaks for the organization when we're phoned up about a particular crisis, and this is in the children's area. So if there's a crisis with a child, who speaks? Do we have to go to national, who is not in touch with where we are? And so I can see that there are advantages to the nationalization, for want of a better word, or the merging, but there could also be disadvantages. And I just wanted your thoughts on that.
Thank you for the question, Pat. That always is a process of risk that you have to carefully analyze. I was involved in a process in about the year 2000 where an organization I was a part of sort of moved into a national space. And that is often very, very difficult. All the questions that you ask must be done before and concluded before you ever merge with anyone or move into a national space. It is a highly complex process, and take nothing for granted there. Do not do it until you've answered and asked and answered every single question, down from how do we order the stationery, down to what happens if there's more money in one region and the other regions don't have money. How do we solve cash flow? How do we provide for transport? Who buys the vehicles? Who pays the staff? Who hires? Who fires? Who takes care of discipline and labor issues in the organization? Who reports on the organization? What happens to the donors? Does the donors now belong to the local entity, or do the donors belong to the national entity? There are 1,000 questions or more that you have to ask before you proceed on that. And no question in that kind of process is unrequired or unnecessary. You probe them to the nth degree, because unless you do, that question that you haven't asked will be one of the first questions that will pop up and trip you up in that process. So probe everything. It's always a great process, and you should talk to people like Christine Quickfall at Bedisa and to other NGOs who have done that process and how they cope with the infrastructure. Because one of the big things of the national office is to manage infrastructure and leadership. How you keep the system going so that the people on the ground feel connected to the bigger body. That's a crucial thing. So it's going to turn your whole management infrastructure upside down. It's going to touch on issues of sustainability, because one of the questions that people often ask down the line, 3-4 years down the line, is who've now moved from local entities into a big national structure. One of the questions they do ask is, who funds national? How does national make their money? And then there are rules such as, well, every rand you get into the local office, 20% or 30% must go to national. And the local NGO says, you know, we used to own all our money. Now we must give 30% to national. And they don't do any of the work. We do the hard work, but national sits there and tells us what to do. Those are the fundamental challenges that will come up in this kind of creating of national offices. I'm for partnerships and consolidation of services and for mergers. But unless you've asked all the questions, please don't do it. Do it only when you have sufficient experience, questioning, and broad consultation about whether that's the right thing to do.
Thank you, Lorenzo.
I hope that helps. Are there any fun questions? One of the fun questions I want to ask you, and maybe you want to respond to that because this is getting very serious. I want to ask you, what questions do you want to ask donors? So what would you ask a donor today that you think is an important question to ask? But let's have that as a conversation, but let me take the next question.
Next, we have Ashley Rahman. Welcome, Ash. Nice to have you in the space.
Hey, thanks, man, Colleen. Hey, Lorenzo. I wanted to, I think what you're talking about is the intellectual economy, right? When you're talking about the need for these ideas that will really kind of influence how we shift society, right? So that there is this benefit for society at the end of the day, and we're not pouring our ideas to start changing, creating the kind of society we want to see. Now, my one challenge is that what you're talking about, and I think what a lot of NGOs in this space is talking about, is the struggle with trying to get funding from a donor who then gets to determine who he wants to give funding to and who he doesn't want to give funding to. So donors are almost deciding what the social agenda should be. But what NGOs are doing anyway in society, they're fixing problems, right? Which the private sector benefits from, the civil society benefits from, and the public sector benefits from. So, but why is this the case? I think there's something fundamentally wrong with the fact that donors get to decide what the social agenda is. I think we should maybe have a separate fund, right? Shouldn't we have a separate fund, you think, that is taken from the tax money and totally allocated to NGOs, where we get to decide which of these initiatives supports the specific agenda that really creates the impact? Don't you think that the donors are trying to decide what the social agenda is for the common good, and maybe they're not entirely interested in that, and they're just interested in their own benefits or how they can market their corporate social investment portfolios, et cetera, et cetera? Shouldn't we rethink this whole system? Because I think like a lot of people are really anxious here that they have to market themselves and sell themselves to an expectation of a donor who's thinking money and rands, where we're thinking about lives and value and social value, which I think a lot of don't understand how to monetize that. How do you monetize someone's life? And how do you monetize change, for example? So something I wanted to put to you as a thinking piece, and what your thoughts are on that.
Thanks.
That's a decolonized mind speaking there. So actually, yes, it is a challenge. It is an issue that is at the moment part of the discourse. To what extent is the agenda set by money or by need? Now, need should drive the agenda, not money. And in the kind of knowledge economy, we talk about that tension between need and money, or cause and resource. And the tension between cause and resource has been there forever. It's not going to go away. And in the knowledge economy, where we go as intelligent beings into a space with donors, we don't diminish the fact that our cause needs that resource. The resource, on the other hand, seems to dictate what happens in that space. What we have to build is that dialogue, because we who are the entrants, the thought leaders in the space, we who are now opening this up and saying, hold on, this is how we want to present ourselves. I don't want to come with a begging document for your rand. I don't want to come and plead with you to invest in the creche or in the disability sector. We are now going with our intelligence into the space, presenting the knowledge economy, and the resource will meet it. We are no longer trying to get money where people feel sorry for us. We are trying to get money from people who want to invest in the causes, because at the end of the day, as you correctly says, as somebody mentioned today in our dialogues, that to address homelessness is cheaper for government than not addressing it. So if you were to shelter and house homeless people, that's cheaper than leaving homeless people on the streets of any kind of space. It's a far greater investment in the well-being of society, the economy, the benefits to people, to children as they grow up, to have housed people than to have unhoused people. Unhoused people is a greater burden on the economy, on the state, on the resource. And so we should be investing in these people and not questioning whether we should be investing. It makes sense that we engage with people intelligently so that we can invest this money. Resource, however, on the one hand, if this is a resource on the one hand, and this is cause on the other hand, we have to make sure that those of us who are part of this knowledge economy begins to bring sense making into this dialogue, into this relationship. Otherwise, it will never happen. There are some hard discussions. Now, this will get better over the next 2 to 3 years, but it's going to be initially a fight for who is more powerful, resource or cause. I believe that it's an equitable relationship. And in most cases, I believe cause should lead the dialogue. I should not be begging for money to create safety for South Africa. I should not be begging for money to make sure that no child is hungry in this country. I should not be begging for money to make sure that people with disabilities have access to equal opportunities. We should not be begging for money so that kids can have toilets in schools. We should not be begging donors for money so that women are protected in this country. It's an absurdity. And unless we lead with a different dialogue, and that's where my call is, to go in with a different conversation with donors, we will keep losing the battle between resource and cause.
Thank you, Lorenzo. Next up, we have Lamur. Jabbar, are you with us? Welcome, Jabbar.
Hello, Jabbar. So you can do both. If you want to do both, you can do both. Okay.
No, thank you. I just want to say thank you that I'm going to stand and speak at the same time. So then maybe there are people are watching us. So I think to prepare to provide and teachable. Yes, we don't have interpreter, but lucky I have the app where I can read while you are talking. Okay. While I would like to read and really your comments, your feedback, there's something that I would like to ask you because I am from the deaf community and I've been working in the deaf community for almost 20 years and I've seen the big challenges. And today I'm working with all disability and I've seen a lot of people, they exclude the disability in South Africa. They're not included. In other words, we have many NGOs and there's a lot of opportunity that can be given to our disability, but it's not working. So my aim is to ask you for advice. Should the people with disability open the NGO or private organization? Because there are so many NGOs, are providing the same service, but are not coming for people with disability like myself. I'm a deaf person and I've been working for the NGO for the past 12 years. And they are something that I want to do on my own. But the problem is there are too many NGOs. And it is worth it to open a private organization or NGO. And the same thing is with I spoke earlier on about the CSI program. The CSI program is big challenging because sometimes they want people with disability to have a high qualification or the people with disability should have high expectations like the cafeteria. But the problem is our education for disability is very bad. So how can we bridge the gap between the education level and the disability in the NGO or private organization? So I'm not sure if I'm making sense, but my biggest concern is that the disability are excluded. So I know community change has been involved for many years. So please answer because we cannot make the deaf people and people with disability out of the blended environment. They have no knowledge of how to start the or private organization. Thank you.
Jabbar, before you go, you and I have spoken about some of these things for quite a while. And I appreciate the fact that you are an advocate for a better dispensation in this sector. You've played a huge role in building an awareness through the work that you've done. For those of you who don't know, he was Mark Lottering's interpreter a week ago on the show, and he did a fantastic job. So yeah, I mean, taking your skill forward doesn't mean that you don't have to start a business yourself. So you can do a business or an NGO. If you have a particular skill set, the default position is not just starting an NGO. In terms of social enterprise development, there's a whole range of options for you in terms of what you can do. You can start a not-for-profit company. You can start a formal company. You can do a business where you sell your skill to change society. There's no reason why these divisions are as profound as they are. We need more businesses, in fact, Jabbar, that will be businesses that will effect social change. It doesn't only have to be an NGO. Yes, there's a pool of money you can obviously access through the NGO system, but there's no reason why a good business should not be a changer in society. Now, a lot of businesses have adverts that tell us they change society, but they don't essentially do. They're about capital. But if your passion is to change society, but you want to do it through a business enterprise, please, we need more models like that in the country, where there are great business ideas and they're creating massive social change. In fact, I believe that is going to be the future. I believe there's going to be a new dispensation where businesses will orientate towards justice, will orientate towards inclusivity, and will orientate towards national prosperity. These kinds of siloed divisions of that we make a lot of money and we give some away is beginning to be an archaic idea. And we're going to begin to frown on people whose wealth have only come from doing that. And yet all around them, there's mass poverty. And so we are looking for ways to enrich the ecosystem by the kind of models you are talking about. I would encourage you to start a business that does good in society.
Thank you, Lorenzo. Your next question is coming from Ashley Potts. Welcome, Ashley.
Hi there. Sorry, man.
Hello.
Having a problem. Hi, Lorenzo. Colin, good to see you again.
Hello.
Thanks for the opportunity. Excuse the little one here next to me. So
No
yeah,
problem.
once again, I haven't been thinking much about the endowment, but I think it is absolutely a way to go. And I'm not going to pose my question to that. I'm concerned about the way there is a seemingly dictatorial methodology from province and government, the way they fund organizations. And I'm seeing more and more frustrations among the NGO sector to a point that they no longer want money from government. When that happens, government no longer is directly involved with social development within the context of local community. And I'm wondering if anyone is challenging government on that and how we can challenge them, because it will be a real travesty and a global negative message if our society says we do not want money from any governmental organization because there is this dictatorial mandate that they place on us that almost forces us, I use a harsh word, but it's real, forces us to prostitute ourselves to do what they want and not what community needs.
Ash, that's a great question, and thank you for asking it. Listen, guys, I mean, let's understand this. The world has changed fundamentally. You have to know now that what we have today is very different than to what we had on the 26th of March. You've got to get your mind around that. Don't wait for government to tell you that the world's changed. Let's agree tonight the world has changed fundamentally. It will never be the same again. I want to say that to you with such conviction tonight. Where government sort of controls some of the space through legislation, where they control certain certificates they issue for service delivery, certain registrations of service provider entities, or they zone or rezone, or they provide buildings, and they, all of that government can play. But here's the thing we have to adopt, and not just with government, but also with every funder. No funder, including government, must own you. You must always be independent, and you must be able to say to a donor, no, that money does not make sense to me. I don't wish to do that. And walk away from that funding. And you must be brave enough to turn the funding down. In fact, I believe that if there's a mass turn down of government funding today, it will wake government up. Let me give you an example. The courts deal with a case of a young person who needs care. The courts remove the child by the social worker, brings him into the system. The child is at risk at his home. The courts then bring the social worker brings the child to the court. The court then says this child must go into care. The court then says to the child and the social worker, place the child at Children's Home X. Let's say Lily Bloom Children's Home. Place the child at Lily Bloom Children's Home. Lily Bloom Children's Home then receives the child, because the state is now placing the child there, and the state then says to the home, because we fund you, you must take this child. And so the principal would say, yes, okay, we'll take this child. Here's the problem. The state only funds a fraction of the cost of that care. Here's my question to the state. If you are sending us children that we must take care of, then you have an obligation to fund 100% of its cost. Not say to the NGO, here's the child, take the child, and pay the rest of it, find the money for the rest of it. That is putting the child at risk. It's not care. You're putting the entire childcare ecosystem at risk with that kind of irresponsible behavior. If you want the institution, the private institution, to care for the child, then you should pay the full bill at that institution's doors to fend and care for this child. Not say to the NGO, we remove the child from his or her parents, we place them in a temporary facility, we've let the child go through the court system, the child is now in a ward of the state, and the child is placed at an institution. And all along that kind of trajectory, or that ecosystem, or that line, you only pay a fraction of the cost. And you expect civil society, here's my point, you expect civil society to pay that bill, but you place the child in care. That's the immorality of this kind of engagement. We have to make sure that we have that discussion with government. And if children's home today were to say to the state, we will no longer accept placements by you because you do not pay the bill, let's see what happens then. There's a whole new discussion that must be had with the state around placing children in children's homes or childcare facilities or in youth centers, because the state does not pay the bill. No donor that does not pay the bill in full can dictate to you that you must do what that donor says. That's the fundamental point I'm making.
Thank you, Lorenzo. Next, we have Valdi. Welcome, Valdi.
Everyone, a very exciting and long-awaited dialogue. I want to focus on the idea of partnerships, and I think partnerships is extremely important for where we find ourselves. We must also be very conscious of where civil society is now. And we tend to have a very homogeneous thinking about civil society as a group of people who come together to work at helping society. But it's not always like that in reality. So my question around partnerships is, in communities in a province such as ours, where we have high levels of mistrust, high levels of networks and coalitions coming together and falling apart. Merging, partnering is not new phenomena. People have tried that. And how many times have it fallen apart? And so you begin to work with burnt fingers. You go into these networks and partnerships. But if we want to succeed, and I make no apology for saying that I feel NGOs should be socialists, because you cannot begin to deal with social inequalities, social injustices, when you are thinking from another political paradigm. So what I'm very interested in is wanting to understand what are the ingredients that is needed in a highly fractured civil society. We are fractured and we are bleeding. How do we begin to work together? What is the criteria? Do we need to be like-minded? And then another area that we've been thinking through, a number of us, is, should we be working as interest community-based NGOs as we see gender-based violence moving? Because the challenge with that is that it's not holistic. We only begin to deal with gender, and then we begin to forget about systemic and structural issues that impact on gender. But we say we're working against gender-based violence. So there are all of these aspects that pull us together and pull us apart at a time when it's very clear that for individual organizations to gain money and big money, you must be known in the media and you must be known in the donor world. But if you are Joseph from Hanover Park, who's working with mothers who've lost their children to gangs, then you don't necessarily, Lorenzo, have that 10-minute conversation with a funder, because your heart is beating so fast that takes up your 10 minutes already. But you are well known, you've got the savvy, you've got the, our grassroots organizations don't like that. They walk into the building of the donor and the donor's already telling the security, this day now. So we are not all equal in civil society. We are not all regarded as important. Our work is not regarded important. And yet, in order to work well together in this country, where we have a high level of violence, you cannot say that only trauma counselors and only social workers must work together, because healing cannot happen through that. So I'm asking Lorenzo and others, what are these factors, the criteria that we need, given our context of division, given our context of fractures, competition, what is needed to get a group of like-minded people to actually come together from different sectors to say, I am good at this, but I want to acknowledge you are good at that, and together we can maybe gain joint funding. How do we firstly get to that point? Secondly, how do we then move in terms of implementation? Because now we're singing Kumbaya, we got the money. Now that we get the money and we start implementing, how do we maintain those stuff?
Okay.
Thank you,
I hear
Valdi.
you on that. Thanks, Valdi, and great to see you, Valdi. So let me answer this question in this way. We should all get off our high horses. Most of us are far too important, including myself. We should begin to make room for everybody else. Yes, we work hard to get our messages out there, and yes, we work hard to promote what we do. But I think there's a selfishness in what we do, which is sort of a disease in the system, in the sector. And we should be making room for other people all the time. I, for example, changed my title from CEO to, I think, some crazy thing called solutions designer, which nobody likes. Because quite frankly, it doesn't matter if I'm the CEO of Community Chest. We should all begin to take a step back from that and create space that is an equitable environment where people can treat us as normal people and we embrace others and bring them into the circle, into this community of causal individuals, people who are standing for a cause. There's too much nonsense going on about how important you are, how accessible you are, how inaccessible you are, what you know, what conference you were at, what webinar you were at, what overseas donors you found. That's a whole bunch of baloney. I want to know, how do I work with partner X to fortify the impact in Tafelsig or in Lavender Hill or in Beacon Valley? That's what we got to talk about, not the kind of nonsense we engage with about how important we are in this space. That is an absolute death to our sector. All of us, me, you, and everybody else who lead NGOs or engage in the leadership of NGOs or sit on boards should take a step down. I've often said, I teach a seminar called Mind of the Fundraiser, and I've often said this. I said that if you want to be a great leader of an organization, make sure that your fundraisers are more intelligent than you. Those who attend the fundraising course that I teach will know that. You have to employ fundraisers who are smarter than you. It's a fundamental principle. You're going to raise up people who know more about the world than what you do, because that's the only way you're going to sustain your income. Because I do a lot of things and I'm not always in front of a donor as I would love to be, because I enjoy the space particularly. Your fundraisers must be smarter than you. They must be able to tell you stuff that you don't know and that you are trying to bring together. And so all across the organization, you bring in people who are smarter than you, who are brighter than you, who are greater than you. That's how you fortify. Too many NGO leaders are like some kind of royal duck on a throne that is just a bunch of nonsense. Yes, you've worked hard to start your NGO, and yes, you did a lot of work, but you're not going to grow with that kind of mindset. We have to reach out and build strong coalitions amongst people to fortify the cause we are in, not just the NGO we are in, to fortify the community we are in, not just the NGO we are in. That's how we build a great democracy, not on these kind of petty conflicts we have about, I can't tell you who's funding me because then you are going to steal my donor, or I don't want to expose my staff to you because you're going to steal my staff, and I don't want to work with you because you take all the glory if I do all the work. All those conversations, everything I've just said exists today, and I want to say to you, they need to die and die quickly.
Thank you, Lorenzo. We have time for one last question this evening. I just want to say there's lots more coming in. Unfortunately, we're running out of time. However, this will become a monthly session going forward, so there will be more time to engage with Lorenzo. Last question from Alwyn.
Hi, good evening.
Hello.
Hi, Lorenzo and Colleen. I represent an NGO that has land at our disposal. Now, I know during this trying times where everybody's struggling with funding, and we realize that there's a need to find alternative sustainable initiatives, right? So my question tonight is, how do we go about identifying stakeholders that we can engage with to do, for example, like your request for proposals on what we can do for the land, with the land. And also we would need donors to help us to develop the land because we don't have that capital. And we want sustainable infrastructure and projects that are aimed at delivering services to our clients. Yeah, so if you could just on that.
Let me tell you what I would do with land today. This is just the Lorenzo David's view. I would build social housing, inclusive housing on that site and earn an income from it by making houses available for poor people. That's what I would do with any vacant land today. But that's just me. I think that the great need for the moment is social housing, where we build affordable units where poor people can live in. And the rental there, both as an income for your NGO, which is APD, and as well as, sustain the operations of that particular social housing cluster. It really is a fundamental issue. People should be living close to the services they require. And so if your clients can live in that space, my goodness, just think of what a great ecosystem you are developing. But what I think you should do is, here's my idea what you should do. So that's my idea as to what I would do with the land. But what you should do as APD is put it out to the sector and say, hey guys, give us ideas on what we should do with this land. Your board alone can't think through that because this is a far bigger issue. And that should be true of all NGOs that own land, churches especially. Talk to the community, put it out to the broad NGO sector in the Western Cape, post an ad in the paper and say, we have vacant land, give us ideas on what to do with the land. I think that's where the energy from this will grow and will come from. It's a great initiative, and I'm glad you're putting that out in the public domain, because that's such an important issue. There are stacks of vacant land that NGOs own that I know of. And like you, they're beginning to think as to what to do with that land. One of the big needs I know of is social housing. Thank you, Ellen, for raising that question.
Lorenzo, I'm going to ask you to close the session. We have 5 minutes left. Thank you for all the questions that came in. Over to you, Lorenzo.
Great. So I want to close this very quickly with a 2-minute comment and say, unless we talk, we will not know. Unless we ask, we will not grow. Dialogue is fundamental to how we exist. Conversations that does not judge, but empowers. Conversation
It seems like we have lost Lorenzo. Let me close by saying thank you so much for all the participants. Your questions are noted. We're sorry that we couldn't get to all of them. Please note that this will be a monthly session going forward, and we look forward to engaging with you next month. Thank you so much. Keep well. Bye-bye.